Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon or this evening, tonight, whatever it may be for you. I'm Paul Saunders. I'm president of something called Energy Innovation Reform Project, but also a senior fellow and a member of the board of directors of the Center for the National Interest. I'm very pleased to be with all of you today to moderate our panel. I'm going to be very brief. I really won't give an introduction to this topic. I think everyone understands why the topic of these disputes surrounding interference is an important one. We will therefore really jump right into the program here. I've asked each of the speakers to limit his remarks to 5 minutes so that we can keep things moving along and have a good discussion. We will start with George Beebe, then go to Andranik Migranyan, Joseph Nye, and Konstantin Remchikov last before we open it up for questions. I'll also introduce each of them only very briefly to keep things moving along. It's a very distinguished group. I think some of the biographical information was in the invitation. All of them may be known to you who are listening in. So let's start with George Beebe, who's the Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest. And earlier in his career, kind of led Russia-related analysis at the Central Intelligence Agency and spent really a career there and elsewhere in government. And certainly a long time U.S.-Russia watcher. George, take it away.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. I want to give you my bottom line on this topic up front, and that is that I believe our public discourse on this topic of election interference has lumped too many things together under that very broad term. And as a result, we haven't been able to distinguish between activities that are probably inevitable and not particularly damaging, and activities that are truly dangerous and which we can and I think must do something about. So I want to break this term down into some more specifics and hopefully set up our later discussion on this webinar. So if you think of election interference as an escalatory ladder ranging from relatively low level to very, very serious interference activities, I think at the very bottom rung on this ladder is simple news content. And this was something that, if you recall, in January 2017, there was a intelligence community assessment that came out that talked a lot about Russia's RT and Sputnik broadcasts and what they were doing in 2016. I will say that I think that that is certainly going to continue during the 2020 election. A lot of this is going to be news content that Americans won't like. But I would also say this is not going to affect the elections. We shouldn't really worry very much about it. The next rung on this ladder are social media postings. And this is also something we saw in 2016. And I think we will continue to see this through this fall, at least on a small scale. The Kremlin, I believe, is convinced that Americans are doing this toward Russian audiences. And I believe it probably sees very little to gain by insisting that Russians stop posting in social media on US issues unless it has some kind of guarantee of US reciprocation. I think also the Russians have some important incentives to engage in social media campaigns that are independent of any kind of ambition to affect the election or to divide American society. Now, what are those? I think that any foreign adversary that worries it might wind up in a real shooting war with the United States has a good reason to explore ways to defeat us before the bombs actually start going off. And one of the possible ways of doing that is to exploit the potential for sowing confusion in our information sphere. And in the digital world, algorithms are what often decide what information goes viral. So if I were in the Russians' shoes, I would have a very strong reason to experiment with how to exploit or fool these algorithms in order to gain expertise that I could use sometime in the future if I really need it in an actual conflict with the United States. And I think that kind of experimentation will almost inevitably involve very provocative information. I think we all know that outrage is what seems to be the key to getting engagement online. So I would expect the Russians, at least at some level, to continue to use social media to try to figure out how to create engagement and to put some arrows in their quiver, so to speak, as they try to deal with US power. The next three rungs on the interference ladder, I think, are where things really start to get interesting. And the next one is the dissemination of hacked but accurate private information. Now, we saw this in 2016 with the hacking of John Podesta's emails, for example. And I think it's very likely that the Russians will use cyber tools to collect non-public information related to the election this year. Cyber espionage is a big part of intelligence collection these days. And I think if we know anything about politics, it's that politicians are going to be doing things and saying things in private that would prove embarrassing if they're made public. So I think it's very likely that the Russians are going to capture some of it. The real question is, will the Russians publish it? There's one where I think the chances are decent that they would not. Now, why do I think that? In part because I think they remember what happened in 2016. I'm not sure that they're eager to have a repeat of that kind of controversy in the US-Russian relationship right now. And also, blackmail material is generally more valuable if you hold it in reserve for the future when you're dealing perhaps with an American president you might want some leverage over. So, depending on what might be collected, I think there's a decent chance that they would not want to deploy it to try to affect an election outcome. Two more rungs on this ladder. One is disinformation. You hear that term used a lot, oftentimes very loosely. But what it is the deliberate dissemination of information that the publishers know is false or deceptive. And this is something that could have a real impact on an election campaign, particularly if it takes the form of deep fakes, these manufactured audios or videos that attempt to show as fact things that are in fact invented. I think the chances that the Russians will actually use this kind of disinformation in the election are not particularly great. I think the reasons for that are very practical. The Russians probably realized that this would be detected sooner or later and that it would invite retaliation from the United States. So it's quite possible. This is the kind of thing that the Russians are good at doing. They have the technical capability, but I think the probability of this is not particularly great. Then the very highest rung on this ladder is actually disrupting or altering the process of voting, of collecting and tallying votes that could change the outcome or discredit the outcome. This is something that modern countries can do. It's certainly within Russia's technical capability. It would be truly damaging. I also think that it's something that we can do a lot to deter, to mitigate or prevent. And so I don't think it's very likely that the Russians are going to do that. I think they would expect that this kind of thing would clearly cross a red line. It would invite some particularly damaging retaliation. So that's how I see this broad issue of interference. I think it's important for us to make distinctions between the different types of activities that fall under this heading, because those distinctions help us focus on what's most threatening and what we really need to focus our policies on to avoid the most damaging potential outcomes. Thanks.
Thank you very much. George. So now let's turn to Andranik Migranyan. Andranik is a professor of international politics at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, also a longtime informal advisor to Russia's government. Andranik, your thoughts?
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. George, I really am surprised that until now, this problem is in the center of American discourse in Russian-American relations. Many times I had a chance to tell, even in your center, the national interest, that in Russia, this problem is very peripheral. In Russia, nobody takes seriously that Russia had the capability to open some accounts in social media to spend some money, 100,000, I don't know how much money, and have a real impact on American elections. Listen, you spent billions and billions of dollars. You are controlling everything in your social media, in public sphere, in politics. And this, if Russia could have a chance using such a, tiny amount of money and several accounts in social media and get their president in America, it means that Russia is omnipotent. But just before the elections in 1916, Obama was telling that Russia is a regional power, torn in, in fetters, which was absolutely minimal possibilities for doing anything in this world. That's why we, of course, it flattered Russian, public opinion and Russians that we are so omnipotent. We can use minimal amount of money, minimal resources, and elect our president. It's laughable. Nobody takes serious this, and this is not, it doesn't, this problem doesn't have any significant, meaning in Russian internal discourse and in Russian public opinion. And what you mentioned, that one of the CIA directors said that Russian high-ranking political officials, they were bragging that this was one of the best covert operation in, intelligence operation against America. I never ever heard that anybody was talking about that, and nobody believes that intentionally anybody really wanted to do that, and even to achieve this kind of result. It's just absurd. For Russian point of view, this is just fantasy. This is Hollywood fantasy. And another important thing about which I would like to say, there is really some ideas that Russia is trying, might be, to sow some divisions inside American, society between different ethnic, racial, religious groups, and trying to counter America's attempts to influence in world affairs and having, unlimited possibilities to pursue its goals. It's something quite natural, of course. Unfortunately, we are not putting America in our national defense or national security documents as adversary or as enemy, but you are putting Russia together with China as the main, adversaries. If we are doing something, yeah, we are doing something, of course. Because if you are pursuing your own goals, not taking into account our interests in, post-Soviet space, you are not taking seriously our interests in many other areas. Of course, we are trying to increase our capabilities, doing closer cooperation with China, acting more decisively in Middle East, doing our more serious, involvements in near abroad, as we once called post-Soviet space, and trying to consolidate our resources and capabilities. This is quite normal. It is not something which we are doing with our US because we don't like America or we are challenging America. We are defending ourselves. We are not the initiators of this kind of activities. Our position is reactive. We are not initiating any conflict with the United States. We are not withdrawing from all these agreements, intermediate and, rocket treaties, or now we are, have problems with this strategic arms treaty, which now is expiring, and many other treaties from which America withdrew. They just are destroying every kind of multilateral agreements which we had for many, many years since Soviet period and now Russian period. What I am trying to emphasize at this moment, at least, Russia is just reacting to American acts which we are taking seriously. We don't agree with them, and we think that this American, actions must be in a way countered, and Russia is trying to create some counterbalances. Otherwise, we think that America, after collapse of Soviet Union, decided that America is omnipotent. America can do everything, neglecting and ignoring UN, Security Council, and everything, and can go Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya.
Andranik, I'm sorry. Could I ask you to wrap up? It's getting close to 10 minutes, and we promised 5.
Okay, it's not a 10-minute, but I'm just, yeah. And as I said, it's just an attempt to counter and to stop this idea of omnipotency of US.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So now we'll turn to Professor Joseph Nye, a very distinguished public servant and academic. In this context, I guess I should mention a former chairman of the National Intelligence Council and also a former dean of Harvard's Kennedy School. Professor Nye.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's nice to be able to join with Russian colleagues to discuss this issue, because I do believe it's an important one. If we look to the past, I don't want to spend time on the past. I think the record is actually pretty clear that in 2016, the Russian government, as well as non-governmental actors, intervened in the American election. The Mueller report spells that out quite clearly. A more independent source is the recent book by Thomas Rid called Active Measures, which goes into great detail exactly what the Russians did. So I don't want to rehearse that. I mean, that's, I can well believe that public opinion in Moscow doesn't take it seriously, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. If you look at the present, which is where we should focus a bit now, I do think this issue is getting in the way of improving U.S.-Russian relations. I think the state of U.S.-Russian relations is quite bad right now. And I don't think that's good for the United States. I don't think it's good for Russia. So we ought to be seeing what can we do to clear away an issue like this so that we get to the main business of having a more serious dialogue between two major powers on a whole variety of issues. But if we get this one wrong, and it creates the type of deep and wide resentment in American public opinion that we saw after the interference in 2016, it's going to poison the well. So we have an interest, both of us, whether we think it was important or not important in 2016, we have an interest today to try to clear it away. How could we do this? Some people have said, why don't we have an arms control agreement in cyber? In the UN, the Russians have proposed agreements of this sort. Frankly, arms control agreements don't work in cyber. The difference between a weapon and a piece of otherwise harmless code is often indistinguishable. So you can't write a START treaty for cyber. And these grandiose UN-focused treaties would not work. I was a member of a global commission on stability in cyberspace. It was chaired by Michael Chertoff and Latha Reddy, that reported last year, which had 8 norms for improving stability in cyberspace. And one of them is non-interference in other countries' electoral processes. Another is that top rung of the ladder that George mentioned. But what good is it to have just a norm if the norm is not obeyed? So I have proposed, I wrote in an op-ed about a year ago, that we pick up something that we had in the Cold War that worked relatively well. And that's a set of rules of the road. If you look at the Incident at Sea Agreement, which the two countries reached in 1972, we had great ideological differences, great political struggles, but we both knew that it was not in our interest to let the procedures of close surveillance of the other side's fleet or planes get out of hand and lead to unwanted escalation. Neither of us wanted that. Why can't we do something like that in the cyber domain, particularly in relation to this area of elections? You couldn't be a detailed agreement in, as I mentioned, of an arms control type, but you could imagine each side making unilateral statements of how they see the ladder of escalation and where they draw the red lines. And I think what we heard from George was a good example of how you might proceed along those lines. Yes, we don't like RT and Sputnik. We think there's a lot of propaganda there. I've been on RT and sometimes noticed that the little chyrons which scrolled along the bottom below while I was speaking were critical of the US and had nothing to do with what I was speaking. So what? I mean, that we can live with. But at the upper end of that ladder are some things that we can't live with and which will lead to retaliation and to potential escalation. So why don't we have a meeting in which we each try to spell out the shape of this ladder, explain where the most neuralgic points are, where the red lines are, and then arrange for regular consultations to say, how are you doing on this? In other words, this action you took a while ago, you say it's on a lower part of the ladder. We think it's too high on the ladder. We alert you that if you continue this, we will respond. You say, oh, well, then we can scale it back somewhat, but we don't like what you're doing in that area over there. And you have the kinds of consultations that we had about close surveillance in the Incidents at Sea Agreement. That at least would take the danger out of this. it would defuse the issue, and it would prevent an escalation which is not in either of our interests. So I'm offering a modest proposal for the future, which might make things better than the present, and would certainly make them better than in 2016 in the past. So let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Nye, for that. Let's now turn to Konstantin Remchikov. Konstantin is the owner and editor-in-chief of an influential Russian newspaper, Nezavisimaya Gazeta, and a very prominent commentator in the Russian media and on Russian media matters. Konstantin, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to propose the concept which I work now, that it is called narrative politics. I read a good book by Robert Schiller on narrative economics, and I thought that methodological approach towards analysis of the current day politics, both internal and external, and in our case, in relations with US-Russian relations, is adequate to describe. By narrative politics, I understand the generation and production and promotion and maintenance of narratives which influence other narratives by which decision makers make their decisions, so that to influence the change of the perception of what is going on. And my understanding is that when back in 2016, this John Podesta's email crisis emerged, as in any crisis, because it was very damaging for Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party staff which supported her rather than Bernie Sanders. So in this crisis, usually PR people invent the message which could beat the cause of the crisis. So at that moment, the Russian interference and Russian collusion appeared, and it lasted for many years. And this narrative really determined the decisions which Congress passed, and the economic sanctions, and the perceptions of major media and political forces in both countries. So America was on offensive, Russia on defensive, and so on and so forth. But now, when every day I see how your Attorney General Barr is dismantling a lot in the structure of those anti-Russian narratives, as every day we know that this was not substantiated and that, I think that it just proves that very little objective materials proving that Russia's influence was essential in previous elections. So if we talk about the future, which is always better, then we must realize what is the core in the world, what is the core force in the world which wants influence the outcome of your relations. And to my humble opinion, it is more China. And when I read a lot of information about China's influence in local newspapers, colleges, universities, relations with governors, and I understand that there are a lot of factual material suggesting that China, with their $1 billion at stake in trade, is much more interested party in the outcome that Russia, which I think has a negligible amount of business relations, and I don't know what we can achieve. The major decisions which were taken in Kremlin in recent years proceed from the fact that sanctions are going to last long. Nobody expects that somebody is going to remove sanctions. In this case, it's all the same who is in power, Democrats or Republicans. Kremlin, as far as I understand, is ready to cooperate with anyone who wants cooperation or do not cooperate with no one, because all economy, all political process, all constitutional changes even are taking part in the country, having in mind that for years we'll have sanctions and we'll have to redirect our emphasis and development on internal forces. And even yesterday, President Putin advised that Gazprom develops a gas supply system in the entire Russian and fixed the dates when they have to go step by step to cover with what was called gasification of Russia, rather than be oriented on gas supplies outside the country, which was usually the main topic. So from this point of view, and again, if you look at, because of course people who are interested, I saw this this British intelligence officer Steele, who was British national. Britain was never punished for their intelligence officer being a part of the American campaign, or Facebook handed over to, I think it was Cambridge Analytica, 58 million personal data of Facebook users so that they could help Trump to be reelected. You, American public, seems to ignore this massive interference in the real election battle and thinks that several million dollars advertisement in social media change the narrative in America, and of course it looks implausible, because every day I watch for Fox News and MSNBC just to compare how different are narratives of this sort of influential channels in America are. So my final say will be that unfortunately we in Russia and America don't have a real stakeholders of good Russian-American relations. We don't have those businesses, academic, scientific, medical, educational stakeholders who really want our relations be good. We always concentrate on something which could happen in the third countries, like in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, or whatever. And unless we have not developed the stakeholders of mutual interests, which are based on material and career interests, then our relations will be fragile and ephemeral. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Konstantin, and thank you to all of the panelists, and of course to the Center for the National Interest for bringing everyone together today. So we'll open it up now for questions. Just as a procedural matter, we will have actually two different ways to ask questions today. One is to use the chat feature down at the bottom of your screen on Zoom and to type in a question. And the center staff will collect those and share those with me, and I'll read as many of them as I can and ask the panelists to respond as appropriate. The other is to use the button to raise your hand. And if you take the approach of raising your hand, again, we'll acknowledge as many people as we can, as expeditiously as we can. Then you actually will have the ability to ask your question by audio. So it'll be important when you do that to have your audio unmuted and also to wait probably 2 seconds after I acknowledge you, so that we're sure that your beginning of your comments isn't cut off. So let's open it up now. And perhaps I could turn first to Maurizio Griganti of the Italian embassy, actually the deputy chief of mission at the Italian embassy here in Washington, and Maurizio has raised his hand. Except I don't think we're hearing Maurizio.
Hi, Paul. Can you hear?
Hi. Yes, we have you now. Please ask away.
Yeah. No. Thank you very much for this opportunity. This is a very, very interesting talk. And I mean, I think that I mean, it's very clear that we had an important point, which is this, I mean, interference is a very important point in the relations between Russia and the United States. And it is, of course, very important for international relations in general. And we all have an interest in a good, positive relationship on this. So my question would be, do you really think that, especially to Professor Nye, I would like to ask him about this possible model that he mentioned about this 70s agreement, if I understood correctly, concerning incidents at sea, because it looks to me a very good model, but I'm not really sure that we could apply it to this field. If you could elaborate a little bit more on this. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't think it's easy, but I do think it's feasible, as long as you don't have unrealistic aspirations. I think if we were trying to write a treaty or to an arms control agreement, it would not be feasible. But the idea that we could express how we see the situation along the lines of George's ladder and express where we would feel that the dangers of escalation were particularly strong, and then develop a consultation process for how we discuss this, I think that is doable. It might, in the current political climate before an election in the United States, I don't see it happening. But after the election, I could imagine it happening. And even before, you could imagine having what the equivalent of mill-to-mill talks about the technicalities of it, how it could be done in preparation for such meetings. So I think this is not an unrealistic type of proposal. It's actually based on the narrow interests of each side as they define their interest, combined with the common interest of not having an escalation that gets out of hand, which is a danger for both sides. So I think it's a modest proposal, but I think it is feasible.
Thank you. Maybe before I take the next question, I could ask one of our Russian panelists to respond to a question from me on this point. Do you think that the Russian government would be open to the kind of dialogue surrounding this issue that Joe Nye has suggested, taking into account his statement that would be after the U.S. presidential election rather than in the next 6 months?
My opinion is yes, definitely, because Russia is ready for specific talks on any problem or any issue in between us. And there was, of course, a suspicion that American State Department is undermanned for this specific difficult negotiations. But as soon as Americans ready and send a good proposal, just concrete, I don't think that we will not respond positively.
Paul, I have a couple of comments about Professor Pai's nice proposal. Professor, we respect you very much. You are very popular in Russian academic circles, and we met in MGIMO and in many other places. And we know that you are very positive and constructive in American-Chinese relations, in American-Russian relations, and you proposed a good idea about might be a constructive negotiations about cyber security. But you know what is the problem? Russia several times had a proposal about negotiations and about the treaty on cyber security. But unfortunately, since George Bush Jr. until Trump, you are withdrawing from every treaty, not signing new treaties, not showing interest in coming together to find some solutions, but you are withdrawing and trying unilaterally to act in international relations. Unfortunately, as always, you said, this is American, I hope, that tango, you need two for tango. But the Russian position is open, we are ready, but you are withdrawing, not we.
Okay, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, George. Please.
A very quick comment on this. I think Joe's suggestion is a very constructive one that we ought to pursue. I agree that right now the United States is not in a condition to pursue it. I hope that we will be sometime later this year or sometime early the next year. We will see. I would add that for this kind of thing to be effective, it needs to be supplemented by some unilateral steps the United States can take on its own, irrespective of what the Russians agree or don't agree, to make our electoral system harder, less fragile, less vulnerable to disruption or destruction. And I also think that for the kind of agreement that Joe is talking about to work, we need to build into this incentives and disincentives for the two sides to abide by it. And that means deterrence capabilities, penalties that go along with the rewards of complying with this kind of thing. That's what's going to make this ultimately successful. The terms of the negotiation itself, what we agree to, are important, but the means that we put in place to incentivize adherence to it are at least as important as the terms of the agreement itself.
I think this is a very interesting topic. Let me perhaps ask Professor Nye a follow-up question here. This issue of dialogue between the United States and Russia surrounding this issue is an idea that's come up a number of times and may be a constructive one. There are a number of people in the American political context who would take the view that engaging in a dialogue like this creates equivalency between Russian interference in America's domestic politics on the one hand and American efforts to promote freedom and democracy in Russia on the other. Do you think that that is an issue that the United States would be able to overcome in order to pursue the kind of dialogue that you're talking about?
I think in the type of unilateral statements that each side would make, Russia would make clear that it was going to go ahead with things like RT and Sputnik, and perhaps even pointing things out in social media. The Americans would make clear that we would continue to criticize what we regarded as human rights violations and things that we objected to on values purposes. Neither of us would give up those basic points. If you tried to prevent that, you basically wouldn't have any grounds for an agreement because they're two great differences. But when you get to the higher rungs of the ladder, then you begin to see common interests which are strong enough that you could get agreements. And so I think in that sense, one of the purposes would be to make clear how each of us sees the shape of the ladder, which rungs we're going to have to agree to disagree and live with each other on it, and which ones would actually lead to something which would have a very strong negative relation on the two countries. And that's to go to George's point. The Americans have to increase resilience of the electoral system. But in addition to that, as the General Nakasone, the director of Cyber Command, pointed out last year, we're developing a new doctrine of persistent engagement, in which we say that when another country is interfering in our processes, we will interfere in their networks to block that interference. You can have a variety of views about persistent engagement as a doctrine, but it does suggest that there is indeed a potential both for deterrence and for unwanted escalation, which is all the more reason to have the two countries sit down and discuss George's ladder and make clear which rungs we will learn to live and let live and which rungs are intolerable.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's very helpful. Now I have a question from Paul Hare that's come through the chat. Paul is on the Center for the National Interest Staff, where he's a senior fellow focused on China. And this is really for our, I think for our two Russian panelists, although I'm sure an answer from one of you would be adequate. Do you see any evidence or indications that the Russian government is sharing its experiences or advice or providing other assistance to China as China interferes in American politics? Andranik, you laughed. That means you get to go first.
Yeah. You know, we have very close relations with China. And by the way, China is the only country which learned a lot of lessons as a result of Soviet collapse. And they are trying to learn these lessons to understand how Russia is now functioning and meeting all these internal and external challenges. And we have very close cooperation on intellectual level, on political level. And of course, we are exchanging our experiences on many issues, including, of course, you know, they are, what is China's main problem during this last several months? Hong Kong problem. What America is trying to do, at least how they perceive what's going on in Hong Kong. Is this the beginning of a kind of, you know, color revolution in Hong Kong than in China? In foreign affairs, some authors are coming with publications that in China is going to be a forthcoming upheavals, and we have to force and make a pressure on China and to create situation for regime change. And all these kind of things are irritating China. And China is feeling that we are on the same shoes with China vis-a-vis United States and the West, especially United States. And that's why we have a very close cooperation and of exchange of experience how to resist this kind of unwelcomed and absolutely voluntary actions on behalf of our partner as United States.
Thank you, Andranik. Konstantin, do you have anything to add on this point?
No, just a couple of sentences. What they call it now, 50 cent army of Chinese trolls. It's a huge army, and it is, I think, they have enough guidance from Communist Party of China, which is these days waging the worldwide narrative war about how China was great in dealing with COVID, how much it helps the entire world, and it changed the rhetorics. And I think that they have certain ideas to promote, and they don't need any of Russia's experience because they think that they're much more successful in this world and much more able than we are. So I even don't think that they need any advice.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Konstantin. So we have a hand raised by Donald Smith. So could we please recognize Donald Smith for an audio question?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
All right, thank you. My question is, if Russia believes that their efforts in the cyber realm with respect to our election in 2016 were so small and insignificant to have any effect on us, and yet it caused such a furor that tanked U.S.-Russian relations for a number of years since then and still exist, why would they even suggest that they're doing anything against our elections, given that they presumably want good U.S.-Russian relations?
Andranik, perhaps you first, since I think you were the person who was most emphatically minimizing Russia's election interference.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think that unfortunately we are the victim, Russia is the victim of Trump's victory. Everybody was thinking that Hillary will win and everything will be fine. And, you know, if Hillary was the president in 2016, nobody even mentioned, even wrote a word about Russia's intervention into American elections. But Hillary lost, and you have to find some scapegoat. Russia is the scapegoat of this presidential campaign. This was Hillary's fault, this was Democrats' fault, and this was the fault of American liberal media. And they are now revenging against Russia. It's not against Russia, it's against Trump, and unfortunately, they are fighting against Trump, it goes to Russia. We are at this, in this situation, we are just, you know, collateral damage of inter-American conflict and fight between Democrats and Republicans. It has nothing to do with Russia and Russia's interference. It's unfortunately the failure of Hillary and the failure of Democrats.
Konstantin, do you have anything to add on that point? And then I'd like to turn to one of our two Americans at least to give an American perspective on Andranik's response.
Okay, I will just simply say that when the question goes like we, as if America is this we, and it is something solid and not divided, then I'm a little bit puzzled, because if, for example, I ask your executive power, president and his assistants, do they believe that Russia interfered in those elections? Most likely they will say no. If I ask most of the senators, they will say no. If I ask Tucker Carlson from tonight's show on Fox News, he will say no. But there are some other people who will say yes. So at least it is necessary when you ask questions to say that it is not generally accepted perception of Russia's interference, especially after all your reports and investigations. And of course, I think that the lesson, if there was in any form interference, I cannot say if it was guided from Kremlin or it was initiated by some people who thought that they should do something. The lesson was very good, and asymmetric answer was very tough. The economic sanctions were very heavy, and I don't think that anyone, even at the closed meetings now, could instruct anyone to do it, because one of the most important lessons of this 3.5 years of Russia's collusion is that digital footprints remain forever. And it is so difficult to hide it that nobody could come to any boss and say, let me do it. And I guarantee you that nobody would know that it is me, it is we. So I think the lesson was very good. And if it is necessary to learn lessons, I think that one will be learned.
Thank you for that, Konstantin. And just one very narrow clarification: when you said at the beginning that senators wouldn't acknowledge that there was interference, I'm assuming that you meant Republican senators.
Yeah, I say that half of, you talk to a majority of the Senate, I would say like that.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that. And
well, can I add a couple of words?
Very briefly, because I'd like to let one of our Americans respond.
You know, because you have a question, did we learn some lessons what happened in 2016? You know, even if we assume, which is wrong, that we had some interference, and we elected our president, Donald Trump, it turned to be that we elected the wrong person, because we don't have anything good with Donald Trump, only problems, not solutions, which means you can't elect for America your president. America electing its own president. He is not pro-Russian, not pro-Chinese, he is pro-American. We know that, and we would like American public and political class to understand that. We are not that stupid to think that we can elect Russian president for America.
All right. George, Professor Nye, Professor Nye.
And I just say, I agree with Andranik that as social scientists say.
You are a smart person, Professor, I like you.
I would say that the results of the 2016 were overdetermined. There were very many different causes of why Hillary Clinton lost, and you could point to half a dozen or so. But let's suppose then that the Russians didn't determine the outcome of the election. Nonetheless, there is very strong evidence that they tried, not necessarily simply to determine the outcome of the election, but to create havoc in the electoral process. And if you look at the book I mentioned by Thomas Rid, he describes situations where the GRU and the SBR were both infiltrating the Democratic National Committee, didn't even coordinate with each other, and sometimes competed with each other and stole information from each other. That is the type of thing that makes Americans angry. You know, that it's not that you had the effect you wanted, but you certainly tried, and that makes people angry. So I think that if you belittle 2016 too much, you're just because of the inability to shape the outcome, it may make people think that it's worth the effort. It's not worth the effort.
George, any thoughts on your end?
Well, just a couple of direct responses to Donald Smith's question. You know, why would the Russians do anything at all on this ladder? I think the answer to that is some of the things that are going on in the ladder, the Russians believe are going on both sides. And absent some change in perceived American behavior, there's very little incentive for the Russians unilaterally to abandon what they believe is reciprocal behavior on their part. And particularly at the lower levels of the ladder, I think there's very little incentive for them to stop. There's a lot of good practical reasons why they would want to continue doing that at a low level. And there's probably reason that they would believe that they wouldn't pay a particularly big price for that relatively low level of activity on that ladder. On the higher rungs, I think there's very good reason for them to think twice before engaging in that kind of behavior. I don't expect it, in part because looking back at what happened in 2016, I think they have reason to think that it was counterproductive. It has caused a big problem in the relationship, no question. So I would say that their reaction to the controversy in our bilateral relationship probably leads to a differentiated approach to these sorts of activities right now.
Thank you very much, George. So I have, at this point, just one more question in our chat queue. So certainly I encourage anyone else who has questions to raise them. If not, we'll wrap up after this question, which is a question from John Evans, a former U.S. ambassador to Armenia and a career State Department official, actually, who also directed the Office of Russian Affairs at the State Department. And John asks, exactly what did President Putin mean when he said that Russia had not interfered in the 2016 US elections, quote, at the state level, unquote. And John has capitalized the word state. Andranik?
Oh, listen, it's very clear. I remember when President Putin made that statement, he said, listen, we are a free country as America. Everybody has his own capabilities and opportunities. If some groups decided to intervene in a kind of activities, it doesn't mean that Kremlin was controlling. By the way, Professor Nye mentioned very important thing talking about that book. In that book, he said that authors are mentioning that GRU and SVR, they were stealing from each other the information, which means that government at the highest level never was involved in this process. Otherwise, we have the hierarchy, you know, we have president, he gives orders and the others are implementing these orders, which means if there was a chaotic situation, it means that many actors were involved and they did their work, and who knows what were their aims. You know, it's very funny when I am reading that the guy who was serving food to Putin, he was the chief actor in interference in American elections. It's so funny, you know, in Russia, nobody takes this seriously because if some White House, you know, chief will intervene in our elections, we'll welcome that. Just come on, do that. We'll be more than happy.
Anyone else? Konstantin, perhaps, would you like to offer anything on what President Putin may have meant?
You know, I will tell you one thing. When they make a file which has a profile of each political figure, candidate for presidency, and they have different facets of this personality, I think President Trump was marked with one thing, but which seems to be very important. He never scolds the Russians on human rights. And other candidates very often are inclined to teach Russian leaders about human rights. So I think that this is, in practical terms, is more convenient. For example, your Center for National Interest, when they invite me, you never scold me on human rights in Russia as if I'm responsible. But there are some other centers, when you appear there on economic topic or macroeconomic, they immediately begin to scold you on this human rights issue. So I think if to talk objectively, Trump is, with all his sanctions against Russia, but in personal terms, he is much more convenient to deal with. And this could be took as a sign why Russia prefers to have him, despite all objective facts, how much sanctions and how much he changed policy towards Russia's economic interests with this Nord Stream 2 gas pipe and others. So that's the only thing. Some subjective preferences are taken as active desire to influence. No, it was a passive analysis. Who is who in American politics? Who is more inclined to talk on this or on that subject? That's what I want to say.
Thank you, Konstantin. So we have one more question, and this will be the final question, and then we'll wrap up. This is a question from Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the Center's magazine, The National Interest. It's a question for Professor Nye. What do you expect, how do you expect Russia will act in 2020 to influence this year's presidential election?
30-30.
I tend to agree with Paul. I mean, no, sorry, I tend to agree with George's point, which was that I think it's not in their interest. And if they act in their interest, I suspect they will downplay this, be more careful than they were in 2016. But on the other hand, if you look back to 2016, what we saw was that there was not a very careful control of instruments of the state. GRU and SVR are both parts of the state. Prigozhin may be, and the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg may be officially outside the state machinery, but certainly the two intelligence agencies are instruments of the state. And if Russia is going to follow George's advice and to realize that interfering is not likely to be in their interest, then they better do a lot more to rope in or reel in the GRU and the SVR a lot better than they did in 2016.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Nye. Thank you to all of the panelists, and certainly to everyone who has, I guess I'll say, tuned in to listen. And finally, thank you to the Center for the National Interest, which I think has done a real service in bringing Russians and Americans together to talk about this very difficult topic. And I think we certainly had a lively exchange. There are a number of important differences of opinion, but at the same time, I think it was a constructive exchange of views, and a lot of credit goes to the center for doing that. So George, thank you, and certainly also thank you to the center's president, Dimitri Symes, for his leadership of the institution. So thank you, everyone. Hope everyone has a great day and stays safe, and look forward to seeing all of you soon again, and hope that many of those listening in will continue to join the Center for future events like these. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.